Welcome back to This Week in Immigration, our in-depth look at what matters right now in immigration policy. I'm Hunter Hallman.
And I'm Jordan Lapierre. On the show this week, immigration in the government funding agreement, unpacking President Trump's visit to see the border wall prototypes, and comparing the criminality of immigrants with the native-born population.
You can subscribe to this podcast and all of BPC's podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also stream on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org. While you're there, you can find more information about all the topics we discuss on the podcast. Just go to bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration.
Our guests today, first, as always, Theresa Cardinal-Brown, BPC's Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. Hi, Theresa.
Hi there.
And policy analyst Cris Ramon is here. Hi, Cris.
How you doing?
I want to start with the most recent news, the government funding agreement that snuck in under the wire last week. There was, at least at one point, some hope that the agreement would contain a DACA fix, but of course that did not happen. Why?
Why? There's a lot of reasons why, but I would say the fundamental reason is they just couldn't come to agreement on what the price of a DACA fix would be. Up until the last minute, we understand there was discussions between the White House and Democrats on the Hill about some exchange of a DACA fix for border wall funding. The White House had offered a temporary DACA extension for the full funding for the border wall. The Democrats replied with, how about a permanent fix for DACA and path to citizenship in exchange for the full border wall funding? The White House said no. They then tried a temporary fix for DACA for temporary wall funding, and that didn't go either. So in the end, we've got almost no wall funding and no DACA fix.
So no DACA, no wall, but what immigration provisions did make it in, if any?
So the administration did get $1.6 billion for border security, and that includes some money for something called a border wall system, but very clearly non-concrete barriers.
So not a wall.
Not a wall. Not
Fences,
a wall.
maybe.
Fences and bollard systems, similar to what's already on places on the border. And much of that money is going to go to actually replacing or repairing existing fencing. And less than 100 miles of new areas will have infrastructure. Some of that money is also going toward other technologies like videos and sensors and other technologies that's used along the border. There's money to continue to try to hire Border Patrol officers to their current level, but the president did not get his additional officers that he wants either.
So what happens now with respect to DACA? Do you expect to see action on a permanent replacement at this point, or have we missed the last best chance?
Probably the last best chance this year. There was a last minute flurry also trying to see if there could be a separate floor vote on DACA, but that didn't happen either. I think everything now is just sort of waiting on the courts. When the courts decide whether or not the DACA program will finally end, that will be an action-forcing event, and Congress will take it up again. Depending on how quickly the Circuit Court in California that's considering the case moves and how quickly the Supreme Court might take it up, that could come, frankly, in the lame duck session this fall. So we'll see what happens then.
It felt on a number of occasions throughout this process that we were within a hair's breadth of an agreement. Has that been your experience throughout? You've worked in immigration policy a long time, and it's felt like we've been bumping
close
up against some big steps forward in this space. How was this one the same or different?
Yeah, so for those who remember Maxwell Smart, it's like missed it by that much. And it always sounds like it's closer than it is. There's deals that seem like they should be obvious that people can agree to. My experience has been, frankly, that what ends up happening is that one side or the other asks for something they know the other side simply cannot accept, and they keep insisting on that as the price of doing anything, and so we end up with nothing. And that has happened many, many times, and I think that's what happened here on DACA. And you can look and say, well, the president ended the program, and he insisted on his 4 pillars, and he knew Democrats wouldn't go there. That may be true. The Democrats held out that they wouldn't give him any money for the wall for a very long period of time, and maybe that could have been a deal earlier. It's placing blame doesn't really matter. The fact is we still haven't gotten anywhere, so we have to figure out how we overcome this cycle of getting close and still not getting anything.
And what's your sense of how we do that? How do we get past this?
I think how we get past this is we have to get to a place where everybody realizes that doing nothing is no longer acceptable. They can't keep punting it. That the cost of doing nothing in votes, in constituents, in where we are as a country on immigration is just no longer sustainable. They pay a price for doing nothing. That will cause us to do something.
Okay, thanks, Theresa.
Let's turn now to President Trump's visit to the southwest border. He went to California to view the recently built border wall prototypes. How did folks on both sides of the spectrum react to this visit?
Well, he was met with a lot of protests, let's put it that way. California is not Trump-friendly country. There's a reason it took him a long time to get there. And there were a lot of people in California that wanted to make sure that he knew that they were not supportive of the wall. As a matter of fact, California had sued to stop the building of the wall and the prototypes. They lost that court case. But there were some people that were in favor, and certainly he toured the border with the Border Patrol from San Diego. They were very much in favor of some new infrastructures. He looked at the border wall prototypes. There were 8 different sections, 30-foot wide sections that were built, about 30 feet tall. And basically, I think he was there to say how important he thinks the wall should be. But what happens next is unclear. I think it was mostly a photo op. They didn't get the money in the omnibus, as I said, to actually build any of these prototypes. Without that, the most they can do is sort of figure out from these prototypes what type of wall they might want to build in the future. So this will be up to next year's appropriations and after that.
So President Trump also took this opportunity, this visit, to get in a bit of a spat with the California governor and attorney general over sanctuary cities. What was that all about?
Well, so as we talked about last time, the Department of Justice has decided to sue the state of California over 3 state laws that it says are impeding its ability to enforce immigration law in the state, and that California does not have the right or the authority under the Constitution to do that. So the president has been talking about sanctuary cities for a long time, going back to the campaign trail where he talked a lot about San Francisco's policy that released the immigrant who ultimately was responsible for the death of Kate Steinle. So this has been a hobby horse of his for a long time. But California insists that they are under no obligation to assist the government in deporting people, although they can't prevent the government from deporting people, and they say that that's what they're doing. So this is a political spat. It's in litigation now, and ultimately, I think it is important for the direction of the country. This federalism fight over immigration is going to be important to see exactly how we move forward. If the federal government, as Congress, we talked about, Congress is not able to pass legislation, and the federal government is not able to sort of get policies that states can be on board with, states are dealing with things in their backyard that they have to for their constituents, and this clash is really causing some strains.
So the White House also recently convened a meeting with some select members of Congress and law enforcement on sanctuary cities. Is the administration planning to push legislation on this? Is this part of a growing trend, or is this just kind of one-offs of President Trump's agenda on sanctuary cities?
So there's sort of a lot of different angles the administration is taking. One is sort of this public relations campaign, right? So a lot of public events where they talk about sanctuary cities with law enforcement officers, with immigration and customs enforcement, basically hammering on sanctuary cities to try to get the public on their side to say this is not something that cities should be doing. On the other hand, you have Department of Justice that is using its authority to give grants to cities and states for law enforcement as leverage to try to get them to cooperate more with immigration and customs enforcement. That's having mixed success, but it's putting a lot of pressure on cities and counties across the country to prove they're in compliance. And then lastly, they have asked Congress to pass legislation on this. Like every other immigration legislation, it has not gone anywhere yet, but they're trying. And again, I think some of this is going to be a matter of how much under the Constitution can the federal government force cities and states to help it enforce immigration law, and who has the ultimate responsibility for this.
So back to the border wall. As we've written about previously, border apprehensions are at historic lows and have been for some time now. With that in mind, what tangible effect would the border wall have?
Well, assuming that it ever happens, I think what we have found in looking historically is that for every action that we take to try to secure the border, those who are desperate to find a way to come and those who are willing to profit off of them will find a way to get over, under, around, or through. So the walls may be more difficult to do that, but that I think will just put more pressure on smuggling, for example, through the ports of entry, maritime routes, and visa overstays, forged documents, those kinds of things. It can help, certainly, with enforcement, but again, we are already at pretty low numbers, and the majority of those coming in now are coming from more desperate situations in Central America. They're coming, frankly, to apply for asylum in a lot of cases, and so it's questionable how much deterrence we're going to get. Mm-hmm. One thing I should note is that as part of the Homeland Security funding bill that just passed, they're continuing to push on the department to give it better ideas and metrics of what border security looks like and what it's going to take. So before moving forward with the border wall, I think Congress is going to have some questions about understanding how much enforcement they're going to get for the money they spend.
Do you think the president has missed his chance to get significant funding for the border wall, or do you see another opportunity on the horizon?
Well, the next possible opportunity is next year's funding bill, which, believe it or not, is only 6 months away because we passed this year's funding bill halfway into the year.
I guess that counts as the horizon.
I guess it does. So the president asked for the money again in his FY19 budget. Congress will begin consideration of that budget very shortly. They're already holding hearings. But realistically, I think it's going to be unlikely with the current configuration of Congress that he's going to get another chance at the border wall money. And again, if he does, Democrats are going to demand other things for that.
Okay, thanks, Theresa.
Finally today, a look at whether immigrants are more likely to commit crimes than native-born Americans. Cris Ramon is here, and Cris, you recently wrote a pair of blog posts on this issue, which our listeners can find at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. This is all stemming from Justice and Homeland Security Department joint report issued at the end of last year, I think it was. What did that report say?
So this report basically was an overview of the number of confirmed and suspected non-citizen, non-resident aliens in DOJ custody in fiscal year 2017. And so it provided just an overview of the number of these individuals that were held in all Department of Justice facilities, Federal Bureau of Prisons facilities, and U.S. Marshals Service facilities. And it showed that there were quite a significant number. And one of the blog posts that we wrote kind of went and took a look at what other government data shows about non-citizen populations, particularly in federal institutions. And we took a look at that, and once again we found that non-citizens were a significant portion of the population. Now, kind of stepping back and kind of opening the curtain on how BPC works, after we finished writing these blog posts and we saw that, this data, we thought to ourselves, well, what does this data show and what led to these trends? Because really the conclusion that we had with the federal prisons piece that we put out was saying that, these large numbers doesn't say anything inherently about immigrant criminality. It doesn't even break down the crimes that they have committed for the most part. So we kind of took a step back and we're thinking, well, why are there a lot of non-citizens in federal prisons? And so that led us to kind of begin doing research on the prosecutions of non-citizens or potential non-citizens in the U.S. criminal justice system. And that's where we came up with this blog post that's going to be coming out in a little bit, talking about how Operation Streamline, which was introduced under the Bush administration in the year 2005, which changed prosecution priorities for different individuals entering the U.S., impacted the non-citizen population in federal prisons.
So I want to come back to Operation Streamline in a minute, but first, critics have taken a lot of issue with some of that joint report's conclusions. What is disputed?
So basically, the Trump administration is taking this report and kind of saying that this sort of proves that the large number of individuals who are essentially non-citizens, non-resident aliens, proves that they're inherently criminal. There's a high level of criminality in these individuals because there's more of them in prison. But a lot of critics have been pointing out that just because you have a lot of individuals in prison doesn't necessarily correlate with criminality, especially when you're dealing with something like with immigration, which is a civil offense. That's really important to understand. This is a civil offense. It's not like these individuals, or at least the individuals who are just convicted for immigration violations, did something else that was more serious. Because if they had, say, violated federal drug laws, that would have been the leading charge, and they could have also potentially have been committing an immigration offense, which is civil violation. Certainly, those are problematic. But the thing is that when you're looking at individuals who committed immigration violations, that's the most serious charge, and that's a civil charge. So I think it's important to sort of really look at the nuances of why they're charged, and in order to really kind of go and say, well, what does this say about the inherent criminality of immigrants? And the point, what I just said, a little bit earlier, was that basically a lot of this data doesn't really allow us to make a firm conclusion on that.
Got it. So what is Operation Streamline? And walk me through how that effort has helped, I guess you can say helped increase, has contributed to the larger number of non-citizens in federal prisons.
Right. So prior to 2005, what you saw CPP do is that they would normally channel individuals who entered the country illegally. They were under the Immigration Nationality Act calls illegal entrants, or first-time illegal entrants, come into the country, and normally then they would be channeled through administrative procedures to have them removed from the country. And then, you also had the people who were illegal re-entries who would also come in, would likely be put through these channels as well. Streamline changed that pretty drastically, because what Streamline decided to do was, instead of pushing it through administrative channels for removal, what happened is that the CPB and Department of Homeland Security signed an agreement with the DOJ and the U.S. Attorney's offices to start referring these individuals for criminal prosecutions under the Immigration Nationality Act for illegal entry, which is Section 1325 violation under the INA, or illegal re-entry, which is Section 1326 violation of the INA, and referring them to to the U.S. Attorney's office and to prosecutors for basically prosecuting for crimes, for these immigration
So going
violations.
through the conventional court system as opposed to the specific immigration court system, am I understanding this
Exactly.
correctly?
This is really important. Immigration court system is largely administrative. There are no criminal penalties necessarily, aside from the fact that you're going to be removed from the country. If you go through the criminal court system, you're a criminal. You're going to be facing potentially prison time. And what we saw in the data for prosecutions is that the number of cases filed and a number of convictions are almost like a 1-to-1 match. And so you see a 1-to-1 match, you start seeing more individuals being essentially detained, being convicted. You start looking at the sentencing data. The sentencing data shows that, in particular, undocumented immigrants really started expanding under the period from Streamline in terms of the number of individuals who were being sentenced for prison time and the number of individuals being sentenced for immigration violations, which largely include Section 1325 and Section 1326 violations. So what you started seeing is more prosecutions, more convictions, and then more sentences that then fed these individuals straight into the federal prison system. So it goes back to what we were saying earlier, which is, it's not that these people, some of them did really bad things, but the thing is, if you look at this whole population, it's not like that they're inherently criminal. It's just an adjustment in federal prosecution priorities that really impacted this population. It's not the only key driver. That's not what we're saying, but it was a very important driver.
Has this effort been effective in deterring illegal border crossings? What do we know about that?
So the Government Accountability Office has put out a couple of reports, and one in 2015 that basically said, we've got a sense of what the metrics are for re-entry, but the metrics for sort of assessing this policy on an alien's crossing history, this is from the GAO report, re-entry or reapprehension over multiple years, the metrics don't reflect that. So we don't know broadly whether or not that this policy, which was put in place specifically to deter illegal crossings, is necessarily meeting its goal. So that's really the important part, that it's questionable as to whether or not this is actually working. Now, like Theresa said earlier, apprehensions are dropping at the border.
Right.
For a range of reasons. I think one of the other things that we should keep in mind is that number of individuals coming from Mexico to the United States has dropped off significantly. You have more individuals coming in from Central America, but those people aren't keeping a pace to ensure that the levels of border crossings that you're seeing in the 90s can be sustained. Demographics changes in Mexico, which people don't necessarily think about, but you see a shrinking of the population of individuals who'd want to move to the United States, whether legally or illegally. So there has been a drop. It's not to say that maybe this policy hasn't been completely ineffective, but it's questionable.
Finally, the administration has also made some claims recently about immigrants and foreigners in relation to terrorism. What are they saying on that front?
So they put out, this is another report that they put out under the first travel ban, and what this report stated or intended to really show is that you saw a large number of non-citizens and foreigners engaging in who were charged in federal courts for terrorist-related activities. The problem is that there are two major issues. One, for this whole population, you saw them include in the numbers people who were brought to the United States who were engaged in activities overseas and then brought to the United States. So you started seeing a much larger foreign-born population that really shouldn't be there in the first place if you're talking about terrorist-related activities in the U.S. And you see other studies that actually show that U.S.-born citizens participate in these activities in much greater numbers. What does this all mean? I mean, I think the most important thing is it shows that you're seeing the administration trying to use data to paint foreigners as criminals or as terrorists, when in fact, you look at the data, you look at the big picture, and you're saying, actually, other sources are pointing that that's not the case. Whether it's with federal prison populations, well, they're all criminals. Well, no, this is actually related to policy changes. Well, they're all terrorists. Actually, if you look at other studies, U.S.-born citizens participate in these activities in much higher rates. So the big picture is really, you can't use the data to be able to support these broader claims if the data doesn't support that, or if the data reflects changes in policies that people may not be aware of.
Fascinating stuff. Thanks, Cris.
Thank you.
That's our show for this week. Thanks to all of you for listening, and a special thanks as always to our producer, Gretchen Akins.
Please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to rate, review, subscribe to this podcast, as well as all of BPC's podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center. Join us again next time.